You people let my sister die in there?
I only clean the floors, ma'am.
Then get out of my way!
You trained her to betray me from the inside.
I trained her to survive. Unlike you. This ends tonight, all of it.
He's on his knees scrubbing marble floors while a lobby full of doctors, executives, and one furious woman in Chanel point and laugh at him. Not one of them knows the man they're humiliating controls half the syndicates in Seoul, and by the end of the day, every person in that room will regret it. Amara storms into the medical tower demanding answers after a botched surgery nearly cost her sister her life, and the first person she sees is a janitor kneeling by a mop bucket. An easy target for her fury in front of a lobby of staff who do nothing but laugh along. What she doesn't know is that the man she just humiliated is Jae-won, the notoriously private head of the Cheonma syndicate, who owns the hospital, funds half the doctors' careers, and has spent years moving unnoticed through his own buildings by choice. He lets the laughter continue a moment longer than he needs to. Curious, for the first time in years, about a woman too angry and too reckless to recognize the danger she just put herself in. Subscribe to see how far this goes, and comment where you're watching from. I'd genuinely love to say hey and see how many corners of the world this story reaches. The laughter hadn't even finished dying down in the lobby when Amara's phone buzzed with news that made her stomach drop. Her sister had taken a turn overnight, and the surgeon she'd been trying to reach all morning had suddenly gone completely unreachable, his office lines dead, his assistant unable to explain why. She'd stormed out of the hospital still shaking with adrenaline from the scene she'd caused, replaying the janitor's face in her mind more than she wanted to admit, when a black car pulled alongside her on the street and the back door opened without anyone asking her to get in. She should have run. Instead, curiosity and exhaustion and 3 days of sleepless panic over her sister's condition made her climb in, and by the time she realized her mistake, the car was already merging onto a private access road that had no business existing beneath a hospital parking structure. 2 men flanked her the moment the doors opened again, silent and enormous, and she was walked through a service corridor into an elevator that dropped rather than rose, deep into a level of the building she was certain didn't appear on any public directory. When the doors opened, she was standing in an office that looked nothing like a maintenance closet, glass walls, soft lighting, a wall of monitors tracking numbers she didn't understand. And behind the desk, no longer in gray coveralls, stood the janitor she'd humiliated an hour earlier, watching her with an expression that made her blood run cold. "You," she said, and it came out smaller than she wanted. "Jae-won," he said simply, like the correction was a courtesy he didn't owe her. "And you spent the morning demanding answers from a man you assumed couldn't give you any. Let's fix that assumption." He told her plainly what she hadn't let herself consider, that the hospital, the surgeon's silence, the sudden freeze on her sister's case, all of it traced back to a payment dispute buried in his organization's books, a discrepancy someone had used to quietly stall her sister's surgery as leverage against him. He didn't explain why anyone would target a patient to pressure a syndicate boss, only that it was happening, and that the trail was buried in ledgers too tangled for his own people to untangle fast enough to matter. When she demanded to know why he was telling her any of this, he slid a laptop across the desk instead of answering, along with a folder of raw financial data 3 inches thick. "Because you called yourself an accountant in that lobby, loud enough for half the building to hear," he said. "Prove it. You have 2 hours to find where the funds authorizing your sister's care actually went. If you can do that, I'll consider whether you're useful to me instead of simply inconvenient." Amara wanted to refuse out of pure principle, wanted to scream that her sister's life wasn't a test to be passed, but the clock was already running and refusing solved nothing, so she sat, and she worked, cutting through disguised transfers and rerouted accounts with a speed that surprised even her. She found the freeze order in 31 minutes, buried under 3 shell entities designed to look like routine hospital administration, tracing it back to an account that had no business touching patient care at all. When she turned the screen toward him, Jae-won studied it in silence, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You did that in under 35 minutes, he said. "You said I had 2 hours. I don't like wasting time when someone's life is on the line." He didn't smile, but the coldness in his posture eased by some fractional, deliberate degree, and for the first time since the car door had opened on the street, Amara let herself breathe. "Your sister's surgery will proceed within the hour," he said. "And you're going to help me find out who did this, and why." The unofficial arrangement lasted exactly 1 day before it became something closer to a fixture. Amara, embedded in a wing of Jae-won's operation she hadn't known existed, given access to files that made her increasingly aware of exactly how large and how dangerous the world she'd stumbled into actually was. His people didn't trust her, watched her with narrowed eyes every time she asked a follow-up question, murmured in Korean she couldn't understand but could feel the temperature of. The deeper she dug into the shell companies routing money around the hospital freeze, the more the trail wound through legitimate-looking vendors that had clearly existed for years, contracts signed by people close enough to Jae-won that questioning them out loud felt like a small act of treason. She kept her findings quiet at first, cross-referencing everything twice before she said a word, because something about the pattern, the precision, the patience, suggested whoever built it had been inside Jae-won's trust for a very long time. She was 3 shell companies deep, tracing a wire transfer through what looked like a medical supply contractor, when the convoy taking them across the city to meet with the hospital's board slowed at an intersection it should never have stopped at. The first shots came before Amara had even processed the sound as gunfire, short, controlled bursts that turned the passenger window into a spiderweb of cracked glass. Jae-won moved on pure instinct, hauling her down across the seat with one arm while the other reached for something under his jacket she hadn't known was there, his body angling itself between her and the window in a motion too fast to be anything but reflex. The car lurched hard as the driver cut across 2 lanes, tires screaming, and Amara's heart pounded louder than the gunfire outside as she felt the solid, unmoving weight of Jae-won's hand pressed flat against her back, holding her down, shielding her without a word of explanation. They didn't stop until they ducked into an underground service entrance 3 blocks away, the driver already barking clipped instructions into a phone, and only then did Jae-won pull back enough to check her over. Hands quick and clinical at first, running along her shoulders, her arms, the side of her face, before he seemed to catch himself and stepped back, jaw tight. "You're not hurt," he said, more statement than question, like he needed to hear it confirmed aloud. "No thanks to whoever that was." "A rival organization," he said grimly. "They've been probing my operation for weeks. They didn't expect a witness in the car." He said it almost like an accusation, and almost like something gentler underneath it, and Amara didn't have it in her to untangle which one he meant. They ended up at a safe house on the edge of the city that night, sparse and unmarked like every other space he seemed to move through, stripped of anything that could identify who it belonged to. Jae-won waved off the idea of a doctor with a short, dismissive word, wincing in a way he clearly thought she hadn't noticed, and when she found a first aid kit in a cabinet and set it on the table without asking permission, he looked at her like she'd suggested something absurd. "I've had worse," he said. "I don't doubt it. Sit down anyway." To her own surprise, he did, lowering himself into the chair and letting her peel back his shirt at the shoulder where a graze had torn a shallow, angry line into his skin. She worked in silence for a while, cleaning the wound with hands steadier than she felt, aware the whole time of how closely he was watching her, quieter now than she'd seen him yet. "Why do you keep doing that?" he said eventually. "Standing in front of danger that isn't yours." "Maybe it becomes mine the moment I decide not to walk away," she said, not looking up from the gauze. "Your men would take a bullet for you without blinking. I saw that today. They're paid to." "That's not what I saw in that car." He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice had dropped into something rougher, more unguarded than anything she'd heard from him since the lobby. "I don't let people get close enough to protect. Historically, it ends badly for them." His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary. "You should think carefully before deciding I'm worth the risk." "Too late for that," Amara said, taping off the last strip of gauze, and didn't let herself examine too closely why the words felt less like a warning to him and more like a confession to herself. The encryption signature caught her eye near 2 in the morning, buried in a routing header she almost scrolled past out of sheer exhaustion. Amara sat up straighter, tiredness draining out of her all at once, because she recognized the pattern the way you recognize a voice from a life you thought you'd left behind. Years before she'd ever set foot in Seoul, before the freelance audit work and the quiet, unremarkable life she'd built for herself, she'd spent 18 months on contract with the U.S. Federal Financial Crimes Unit, cutting her teeth on cases too sensitive to ever make headlines. She knew this cipher because she'd been trained on it. It wasn't commercial. It wasn't something a hospital vendor or shell company would ever have legitimate reason to touch. She stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, because the implication was worse than anything she'd let herself consider so far. Whoever had frozen her sister's surgery funding, whoever had been quietly bleeding money through Jae-won's medical and logistics contracts for months, wasn't just connected to a rival syndicate. They were using tools issued to a short list of federal handlers who had no legitimate reason being anywhere near Seoul's private hospital network. Unless what looked like extortion was actually something engineered from much higher up, dressed up to look like ordinary corruption so no one would think to look past it. She found Jae-won in his office long past midnight, jacket off, sleeves rolled, still working through supplier contracts like exhaustion was a weakness he refused to indulge. He looked up when she set her laptop in front of him without a word, and by the third line of what she'd found, his expression had gone very still. The particular stillness she'd learned meant he was more dangerous than when he raised his voice. "You're certain," he said. "I trained on this exact protocol. I'm certain. Then someone inside my organization has been working with your government the entire time." He said it slowly, like testing the weight of it, and she watched him mentally recalculate every relationship in his circle, searching for the fracture he hadn't let himself see until now. They built the trap over the following week, moving in a silence that had stopped needing words days ago. Jae-won staged a manifest for a transfer of syndicate holdings. Cargo valuable enough, specific enough, that anyone with real access to his operation would feel compelled to verify it personally. Only 3 people ever saw the true details. Jae-won, Amara, and the one man Jae-won had trusted since he was a teenager running errands through these same buildings, his longtime advisor, the man who stood beside him at every funeral and every promotion, the one every lieutenant in the organization deferred to without question. Amara watched Jae-won's jaw tighten every time that name came up during planning, watched him resist the pattern for days before belief finally stopped being optional. The bait went out on a Thursday. The meeting point sat at the edge of Incheon's harbor, a warehouse of corrugated steel and stacked containers built to swallow sound whole. Amara stood beside Jae-won in the shadow of a container just past midnight, watching the loading dock through a gap in the metal, and when the side door finally opened, it wasn't one figure that stepped through. It was 2. Jae-won's advisor came first, calm as ever, hands tucked into his coat pockets like he was strolling into a boardroom instead of a trap of his own making. Behind him, stepping into the low dock lights with the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed, was a face Amara hadn't seen in years and had hoped never to see again, her old federal supervisor, older now, grayer, unmistakable. "You," she breathed, and beside her she felt Jae-won go rigid, understanding landing in him a half-second behind her own. "You know him," Jae-won said, low. "I used to work under him." The pieces slotted together with sickening speed. The timing of her sister's stalled surgery, the ease with which she'd ended up embedded in Jae-won's operation, none of it coincidence, all of it architecture. This was never really about a payment dispute. "He's been using your organization as leverage to build a federal case, and I think he wanted me on the inside the whole time, whether I realized it or not." Below them, the advisor's voice carried flat and businesslike across the empty dock, laying out terms with the same practiced ease he'd once used negotiating contracts on Jae-won's behalf, except the terms now were the dismantling of the very empire he'd sworn his life to protect. Her old supervisor's voice answered, cool and precise, outlining how the case against Jae-won's organization would be built once assets were seized, how credit would be divided. How loose ends, her name, spoken almost like an afterthought, would be handled once she'd served her purpose. Jae-won's hand found the edge of the container beside them, knuckles pale, and Amara had never seen him look at anyone the way he looked at the man who'd mentored him since he was a boy, not hatred yet, something closer to grief still deciding what shape it wanted to take. The first shot came from the advisor's side, a warning meant to flush them from cover before they were ready, and after that there was no more listening, only motion. Amara dropped behind a stack of pallets as gunfire opened up in short, disciplined bursts, and old training she hadn't touched in years rose in her like muscle memory, her mind mapping sightlines and exits with the same cold clarity she once brought to a spreadsheet full of buried lies. She caught her old supervisor's tail within seconds. He always shifted right before he fired, a habit she'd clocked once in a training exercise a lifetime ago and never forgotten, and she used it now, calling his timing to Jae-won's men over the comm line clipped to her collar, buying them the half-second edge that turned the exchange in their favor. Across the dock, Jae-won moved like something finally unleashed, precise and merciless, closing the distance on the advisor while bullets sparked off steel around him, until the two men were grappling in the open, all pretense of civility gone, years of loyalty collapsing into a fight that had clearly been building far longer than either had admitted aloud. Amara didn't stay to watch it finish. She worked her way along the containers toward her old supervisor instead, who'd broken from cover and was moving fast for the dock's edge, for the boat idling just beyond the lights, for an exit that would let him walk away clean, the way men like him always seemed to. She cut him off in the gap between two containers, and for a moment he actually smiled at her, like this was still a conversation between colleagues instead of the end of something. "You should have stayed out of it," he said. "You should have picked a less obvious cover story than a hospital," she said, and didn't wait for a response, driving the leverage bar she'd pulled from a supply crate into his gun hand before he could level it, sending the weapon skittering across wet concrete. He was fast, but she was faster in the way that mattered, and it was over by the time Jae-won's security closed in from both sides and put him on the ground, still shouting about immunity deals that no longer existed. By the time the warehouse fell quiet, the advisor lay motionless near the loading dock, and Jae-won stood over him breathing hard, blood at his temple, staring down at the man who'd betrayed everything he'd spent his life building, grief he wouldn't let himself show in front of his men. Amara crossed the distance between them without thinking twice about it, and when he finally looked up at her, whatever wall he had left simply wasn't there anymore. In the weeks that followed, the corrupted federal operation collapsed under the weight of its own exposure, and Jae-won's organization emerged from the wreckage leaner and steadier than it had been in years, its loyalties finally sorted from its liabilities. Amara was offered a flight home, a clean exit, a chance to disappear back into the ordinary life she'd built out of habit and old fear in equal measure. She stood at the window of Jae-won's office the night before her flight, watching the same skyline that had first swallowed her the day she stormed into his hospital lobby, and felt him come to stand beside her without needing to hear his footsteps to know it was him. "You could still walk away," he said quietly. "No one would stop you." "I know." She turned to face him, steadier than she'd been in years, not since long before Seoul. "I'm not going to, though." He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his face eased the way it had the very first night she'd handed him proof she could be trusted, and this time when he reached for her hand, she let him take it, and let herself, finally, belong to something on purpose.